Hi, witches. I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. It's the second weekend of October, and I hope you all are settling into the spooky months. Let me know in the comments if you are celebrating and how you are. Pumpkin spice lattes? Have you decorated your house? Let me know what you're doing. And I also wanted to ask if you've seen the horror movie The Substance yet. It's directed by a woman, which I am a big fan of. So let me know if you've seen it, and if you haven't, check it out. It's really crazy. Most of us go about our day unaware of the whispers of ancient magic all around us. In the darkness, there lies a world of witches and curses, where spells are cast and souls are bound. You must stay aware, or might not even realize the danger nearby. So enter with me, if you dare, the realm of the bewitched. First, the eyes of evil, followed by cross my heart and hope to die. Finally, in our last story, you cannot trust the ones you love. Before we get to our stories, I wanted to ask if you would take a minute to send this podcast to someone you know who loves horror or is excited to get in the mood for spooky season, which we are in right now. We know there are hundreds of podcasts out there, and the biggest influence on what people listen to is what their friends recommend. You can also rate and comment on our podcast on Spotify and YouTube. I read all of them, so let us know what you think. Thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful for all of our listeners around the world. So, want to hear something scary? Curses from the Coven. Deep in Alabama lurks something so terrifying that you'd have to see it to believe it. And believe me, some things are better left unknown, like in this urban legend written by Sara Lukasiewicz. Ellie and Jess had their eyes peeled as they made their way through the dark. The air was thick with the sticky warmth of a southern evening in early fall, the kind that clung to your skin and made the night feel alive with invisible hands. Ellie's sneakers crunched on the gravel as she and her friend made their way along the winding path of Hines Road. They'd all heard the stories, but tonight, something in the air felt heavy. The forest seemed to lean in closer, as if listening, the trees standing as silent sentinels along their narrow route. "Are we seriously doing this?" Jess asked. She clutched her phone tightly, the dim glow from its flashlight barely cutting through the dark. "I mean, the story is not even true. It's just something people say to scare us." Ellie stayed quiet. Jessie wasn't wrong. They were just there to prove it was all fake. Or at least, that's what they told themselves when they made this plan. Everyone in town knew the story of Torbit, the witch who sold her soul to the devil for a long life, not knowing the consequences. Long ago, she lived near the very pond, secluded from the town, with her raven hair and eyes as green as polished emeralds. They said she lured children to their doom, their souls trapped forever in the water, glowing as orbs. Some believed Torbit had returned from hell, haunting the woods, waiting for those foolish enough to come too close. The pair wouldn't have normally ventured out there, but it was a dare, initiated by a boy at school who swore he saw something near the old cabin a few years back. A shadow in the trees, a glimpse of a woman with raven hair and eyes as green as polished emeralds. But as they walked deeper into the woods, a chill began to settle in Ellie's bones, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. Jess suggested they turn back, her voice barely above a whisper. She was the quiet one of the two, the one who had never suggested anything, so when she spoke, it carried weight. "We're almost there," Ellie said, though she wasn't entirely sure of herself. The forest had a way of disorienting people, and there were no obvious markers to lead them toward the clearing where Torbit's cabin once stood. Yet something about the place felt magnetic, as if the trees themselves were drawing them forward. The path opened up, revealing the infamous pond, still and silent like a mirror that reflected nothing. Ellie stopped short, staring at the water's surface. It was strangely calm, unnaturally so, as though time had paused in this place, holding its breath. "That's it," Jessie said, her voice shaky. That's where they say the orbs appear. You know, the spirits of the kids she..." Jessie trailed off, her words swallowed by the thick night. Ellie felt the pulse of something cold, pressing against her skin. The air had shifted, as if the forest exhaled a long-held breath. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Ellie just wanted to get the picture and leave. She pulled out her phone, fumbling with it as her hands began to tremble. She raised it to snap a shot of the pond, but as she clicked the shutter, something moved. Not just something, a figure. Ellie froze. Standing at the end of the pond, shrouded in shadows, was a woman, tall and impossibly still. Her figure seemed to blend into the night, except for one thing, the eerie glint of her eyes. Emerald eyes. "Ellie, do you see that?" Jessie's voice was barely audible, as though the weight of fear had stolen the air from her lungs. The woman began to move, slowly at first, almost gracefully, her long, black hair floating like a dark wave against the night sky. Ellie felt her legs lock, her feet rooted to the ground. The woman's eyes gleamed brighter, more vivid than the moon itself, cutting through the darkness with a bright gleam. "Run!" Ellie whispered, though her body refused to obey. Her friends stood paralyzed beside her, their terror shared in the silence. The woman's lips curled into a grin. It was the smile of someone who knew fear well and thrived on it. Then she rushed toward them, her steps unnaturally quick, closing the distance faster than any human should be able to. Her cackling laughter echoed across the trees, piercing the night with a sound that chilled the blood. Ellie finally found her legs. She turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her feet pounded the earth. Her friends were close behind, but the woods felt endless now, every tree and bush a barrier between them and safety. Behind them, the laughter grew louder, closer. It was as if the air itself crackled with energy. Ellie screamed at Jess to keep going, but her voice sounded foreign in the overwhelming din of her own heartbeat. The path twisted, and suddenly Ellie was alone. Jess was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through her as she skidded to a halt. Frantically looking around, the forest had swallowed them, just as it had swallowed countless children over the years. Her chest heaved with panic, the shadows thickening around her as the air grew colder, denser, and then she heard it, the voice.
"I sold my soul. Now I'll take yours."
It was a whisper, soft and intimate, as though spoken directly into Ellie's ear. She whipped around, but no one was there. The voice was a caress, and this time, Ellie saw her. Torbit, standing just a few feet away, her emerald eyes glowing like hot coals in the darkness. Blood dripped from her fingers, splattering the ground in wet, sickening plops. Her smile stretched impossibly wide. Ellie stumbled backward, her legs weak, the world spinning around her. Torbit hissed, her voice no longer soft but sharp, laced with venom.
"Do you want to join them?"
She pointed toward the pond, and for the first time, Ellie saw the orbs, tiny, flickering lights hovering above the water, the souls of the children, their faces reflected in the water, pale and twisted in agony. Ellie slowly began backing away. Torbit took a step forward, her grin widening, revealing teeth too sharp, too long.
"You will,"
she whispered, her voice now a growl.
"They always do."
Ellie's scream tore through the night as she turned and ran, her body moving faster than it ever had. Behind her, the laughter followed, mingling with the distant wails of the lost souls. She didn't stop until she was far away from the pond, far away from the woman with emerald eyes. But deep down, Ellie knew she'd never truly escape. The witch was part of the woods, part of the road itself. And once you saw her, she never let you go. Are you the friend who leads the charge for an adventure? Or are you the friend who reluctantly tags along? Would you be brave enough to go to Alabama in search of Torbit? Sometimes you're sworn to secrecy, but eventually the secret you're keeping is killing you, like in this story inspired by Sonya. In Sacramento, California, Haven, Jordan, and Michael, a tight-knit group of college friends, stopped by their favorite bar, Blair. It was Friday night and the place buzzed with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Jordan stopped drinking early to be the designated driver. Meanwhile, Haven and Michael, lost in their intoxicated bliss, didn't notice the subtle shift in Jordan's demeanor, the way his eyes darted toward the door as if sensing something lurking beyond the bar's warm glow. Just as Jordan rose to gather his friends, he heard a voice, one so soft, so perfectly pitched, that it cut through the noise like a scalpel. He turned, and there she was, a striking woman sitting by herself. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that seemed both beautiful and unnervingly still, like a painted mask. She beckoned Jordan with a tilt of her head, and though every instinct told him to turn away, something in her gaze pinned him in place. Against his better judgment, he approached. Her voice was low, smooth, and inescapable. "You seem different," she said, eyes glinting under the dim lights. "Like you're the only one here who sees things clearly." Jordan, flattered yet unsettled, felt his resistance weaken. The night seemed to warp around them, the laughter of his friends turning into background static as the woman's presence consumed his focus. Their conversation flowed seamlessly, her questions digging into him, making him lose track of time. His heart pounded in his chest as she leaned in, her breath brushing against his ear.
"I have a secret to share,"
she murmured, her voice dripping with intrigue. But then she asked for a promise, for him to never keep her secret and never tell. She wanted him to repeat an old saying to seal his lips and bind him to silence. He repeated after her, "Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye." As the last word fell from his lips, the bar seemed to darken. Her smile widened, too wide. Her eyes gleamed with hunger. She pulled Jordan closer and began to whisper her secret in his ear. Jordan's eyes filled with utter fear as she finished speaking. Jordan looked like he was going to say something, but the woman put her finger to his lips and said, "Remember, you swore. I'll see if you succeed in keeping the secret longer than them." A faint, sickening pressure began building behind his eyes, like invisible hands reaching into his skull. He staggered back, the weight of the room pressing down on him. Panicking, Jordan shook off the sensation and rushed to drag Haven and Michael from the bar. As they piled into the car, the woman's parting smile burned into his mind. Days turned into weeks, and Jordan became a ghost among his friends. Their once vibrant conversations dwindled into brief, disjointed text. Haven and Michael noticed the change, though they laughed it off at first, assuming Jordan was simply stressed or distracted. But something in the way he avoided them, the hollow look in his eyes during their rare encounters, began to gnaw at them. One night, Michael decided to confront him. When he knocked on Jordan's door, it cracked open just a sliver, revealing Jordan's gaunt face. His eyes bloodshot and wide with something bordering on madness. "Michael?" he whispered, pulling the door open just enough for his friend to slip inside before quickly locking it. Michael entered, the air heavy with a musty, suffocating tension. The apartment was dark, the windows covered, and every shadow seemed to shift unnervingly. He started to speak, but Jordan silenced him with a frantic motion, his hands trembling. "She's watching," Jordan breathed. "She knows, Michael. She knows everything." Michael, now thoroughly alarmed, tried to calm him down. "Who's watching?" he asked. Jordan tried to explain to the woman from the bar. He let her in. He didn't mean to, but he did. And now, she was there with them. She's always there. Michael glanced nervously around the room, expecting to see some lurking figure, but the space was empty. Jordan's paranoia was palpable, his every movement erratic, his voice cracking under the weight of some unseen terror. Jordan began telling Michael about the night of Blair and the woman's strange request. "You have to believe me," Jordan pleaded, gripping Michael's arm. "If you don't keep the promise, she takes you." Michael did his best to convince Jordan no one was there. He could help him. If Jordan would just tell him this terrible secret. In a moment of weakness, Jordan whispered the secret into Michael's ear. Michael tried to respond, but before he could, a suffocating silence filled the room. It was as if the air had thickened. Creeping dread settled over Michael, freezing him in place. He turned toward the living room to grab his phone, but as he did, something in the apartment shifted. A presence, dark and suffocating, pressed in on him from all sides. When he turned back, Jordan was no longer standing. Michael's breath caught in his throat, and he took in the horrific scene before him. Jordan was pinned grotesquely to the wall, his chest violently torn open, ribs shattered like jagged branches. Worst of all, needles had been driven into his eyes, his lifeless gaze staring out into nothingness. Michael staggered backwards, bile rising in his throat. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls vibrating with an unnatural hum. His vision blurred as his mind screamed in disbelief. But before he could flee, a soft voice coiled through the silence.
"He told you, didn't he?"
Michael spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The woman stood before him, though now her face had twisted into something nightmarish. Her mouth had elongated into a jagged maw lined with needle-like teeth, her eyes wide and ravenous. Blood trickled from her lips as she took a step toward him, her form distorted, bending unnaturally as she loomed closer.
"You know the secret now, Michael," she hissed. "And now, you will swear it too."
Michael trembled, his mind racing, his eyes locked on Jordan's mutilated body. The weight of the woman's gaze pressed down on him, suffocating, inescapable. With shaking hands and a voice barely above a whisper, he repeated the cursed words that sealed his fate. "Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye." Have you ever had a horrible secret? Was it about something supernatural? Have you told anyone? Will you tell us? If so, tell us your story by sending us an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. Sometimes rumors can destroy someone's life, but sometimes that person is the one doing the real damage. Like in this story inspired by Christopher Barron. Rook Village was a small hamlet in England in the 1600s, known for two things: its lake, once a shimmering jewel at the heart of the village, and the curse that turned it into a place to be feared. A year earlier, the village's midwife had been accused of witchcraft after several children she delivered withered and died within days of their birth. Despite her pleas of innocence, she was sentenced to burn at the stake. The deaths continued after her execution, and the villagers soon discovered the bodies of their missing children floating in the lake. Rumors spread that the midwife had been using dark magic to claim the children's souls. These whispers took root when Dr. Bryn, the village physician, claimed to have found a book in her possession, a book that described unspeakable rituals involving child sacrifice. It was Dr. Bryn who had led the charge to capture the midwife, and his discovery stoked the flames of fear even further. As panic gripped the village, men began patrolling the lake each night, hoping to protect their children from the midwife's vengeful spirit. While the deaths slowed, they never stopped. Dr. Bryn himself remained ever watchful, haunted by the loss of his infant son, Edward, one of the midwife's supposed final victims. His wife, Edith, had also died during childbirth, leaving him alone to raise their daughter, Celine. His grief and fear consumed him. Celine, still just a young girl, became his last remaining tie to life he had once known. But rather than shower her with affection, he kept her locked away, isolated from the world. She was forbidden from leaving the house without his approval, and she spent many nights alone, longing for the warmth her father had once shown her. Late one evening, after another night of keeping vigil by the lake, Dr. Bryn returned home to find Celine waiting for him, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. She smiled meekly, as if seeking his approval, but he, weary and distracted, barely acknowledged her. She turned away, her quiet disappointment a familiar ache, and retreated to her room as he collapsed into bed. Hours later, a loud crash tore him from sleep. His heart pounded as he glanced at Celine's bed, empty. Panic surged through him as he raced through the house, calling her name. But she was nowhere to be found. He burst outside, shouting for help, and within moments, the villagers gathered, armed with torches and crude weapons. Together, they rushed to the lake, the dark water shimmering ominously beneath the moonlight. At the water's edge, they found her, Celine's small body floating lifelessly, face pale under the moon's glow. Dr. Bren waded into the shallows, pulling her to him, his sobs echoing through the still night. But as his grief overwhelmed him, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. Slowly, he turned his gaze to the lake and froze. Hovering just above the surface, the midwife's ghostly form loomed in the night. In her arms, she held a child, a girl with delicate features and pale skin. Slowly, the child lifted her head, revealing Celine's face. A wave of anger and disbelief surged through Dr. Bren, his anguish turning to fury. He felt the villagers close in behind him, but before anyone could move, the midwife raised her hand. A powerful wave crashed against the shore, throwing the mob back, and a calm settled over the lake. Through the mist rising off the water, the midwife's voice carried across the village. She spoke of Celine's longing, of the love she sought that her father could no longer give. She had come willingly to the midwife, seeking comfort and the care that had been denied her in life. As Dr. Bren stood paralyzed by shock, he saw Celine's spirit turn away from him, her small arms tightening around the midwife's neck, as if seeking solace in the woman who had been wrongly accused of murder. The ghostly figure's words echoed through the doctor's mind. The midwife had not stolen the children to harm them. She had taken them in, offering them the love and care they had been robbed by those who had failed them. Around them, shadows began to rise from the lake, more children appearing one by one. The villagers murmured in disbelief as the faces of the lost children came into view. Sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, thought dead, but now standing before them as spirits, peaceful and calm. The doctor's heart twisted as he watched the children, his earlier certainty unraveling. This wasn't the monstrous act of a witch, it was something else entirely. His gaze darted between the midwife, the ghostly children, and the villagers, now murmuring among themselves. He felt the growing weight of their suspicion as the truth, long buried beneath fear and lies, began to surface. The villagers' confusion shifted into anger as memories of their own children's disappearances flooded back. The air grew thick with tension as they pieced together the lies they had been told, Dr. Bren's lies. One by one, the spirits of the children turned toward the doctor, raising their hands to accuse him. A chill ran through him as he felt the eyes of the mob shift in his direction. He opened his eyes to speak, but no words came. His mind raced to concoct some defense, some explanation, but it was too late. The truth had been laid bare. It was not the midwife who had practiced dark magic. It was him. In his desperation to save his son, Edward, he had turned to forbidden rituals, sacrificing the children of the village to extend the life of his child. The midwife had been a scapegoat, her innocence taken along with her life. A woman from the crowd whose son had been one of the lost broke down in tears as she embraced the spirit of her boy. More villagers moved forward, reunited with their ghostly children. Dr. Bren, now exposed as the true monster, staggered back toward the lake. But the crowd closed in. Before he could flee, an icy hand seized his arm, pulling him backward into the water. The midwife, her voice now barely a whisper, spoke of his crimes. He had condemned her to death, sacrificed innocent lives, and neglected his own daughter in his twisted pursuit of saving his son. There would be no redemption for him. With a final pull, the midwife dragged him beneath the lake's surface, the water swallowing him whole. The ripples faded, and the lake became still once more, as though nothing had ever happened. One by one, the children's spirits disappeared, their souls finally at peace. The villagers stood in stunned silence, unsure whether to feel relief or grief. As they dispersed, a lone villager heard a soft cry from within his home. He had no children, yet the unmistakable sound of a baby's wail reached his ears. Rushing inside, he found a small infant boy, bundled in blankets, lying on his dining table. A note was pinned to the cloth. "Please take care of my son, Dr. Bryn." Have you ever discovered a family secret? Did you confront the person who was hiding the secret from you? Send us your secrets by emailing us at SomethingScary@snarled.com. This week's podcast stories were edited by Sara Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Anna Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sandalo and Calvin Linderman.